Welcome to Meet the Storytellers. I'm delighted today to be joined by Sally Croft. Sally has spent her career in B2B marketing and she really shares my passion for stories. So welcome, Sally. Hey.
Oh, hi Ian. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah.
We have worked together in the past, full disclosure, so we've met in real life, and it's great to spend time together just today to hear you talk more about stories. And maybe, Sally, a good place to start with just, your own backstory and how you ended up working in marketing.
Yeah, sure. So 20, I keep saying 20 and I'm having to sort of make it 22, 23. So I'm now just calling it 20 plus years within B2B and specifically within technology marketing. Full disclosure, I went to university and didn't intend to go into B2B marketing. I certainly intended to go into marketing or communications, but I don't think I even knew about B2B marketing when I did that. I'd kind of grown up in a world where marketing was, from a consumer perspective, what I saw every day, and I certainly didn't intend to go into technology B2B marketing. But fast forward 20 plus years, I am so glad I did. So in that time, I spent a number of years working in software, and particularly in engineering software, where I had opportunities to be working across, multiple geographies. So UK, then went into Europe as well, which was great. I then went on and worked for another software company which gave me really good opportunities to think about how you can take a central marketing message but ultimately make it real in different markets. So that was a great opportunity. But probably the point in which my career had the most pivotal point was when I went and joined Vodafone. So I joined Vodafone UK as their head of enterprise marketing. And it was there where Vodafone, a great British consumer brand, knew exactly how to communicate and how to market to consumers, but didn't know or was challenged with how do we do that to large enterprises. And at the time, Vodafone had just bought, Cable and Wireless, which really changed their customer landscape. So it was a great opportunity to go into a very established brand and really work with them to work on how do we, bring our message to market, which has relevance to the enterprise audiences. Fast forward, had a good couple of years there, and then I went to Samsung, and that was, a fantastic opportunity again within B2B. I just come back actually. I just spent the last nearly year out in the US where I was working for Tektronix, which is an engineering company, where I was leading their global marketing efforts to really think about how do we make our messages relevant from a global standpoint and how do we take them out into all of the markets around the world. And then I came back. So I came back to the UK back at the end of last year and found myself on a journey of where was my career going to take me next, and had a really good opportunity to speak to a number of companies face to face before lockdown happened, and in the UK. And I was in a fortunate position that I could choose. So I chose, and I have been here at Ericsson now for 7 weeks, where I am the VP of marketing, communications, both internally and externally, as well as looking after our government and industry relations. And then finally, and very importantly, sustainability and corporate responsibility as well. So a really, really wide remit of a role across a very, very diverse set of countries. So it's 111 countries in my region that I'm responsible for, and that's everything from Brazil to Russia to Italy to Germany to France, across Europe. So a really exciting role and a very varied role, both of what we have to do but also the countries in which we need to do that in. So
That sounds like a really big job, and we'll come back to Ericsson later, but I'm just curious to know, Sally, that storytelling is such a buzzword now in marketing. And there was some data released by LinkedIn where they looked at people's use of the word storytelling in their job titles within marketeers. And it wasn't until 2012 that you first started to see people talking about storytelling in the marketing industry. And now, of course, it feels like everyone's talking about story, consumer brands, little startups, right through to big global corporations like Ericsson. And I'm just curious to know, get your take, Sally, on why you think here in 2020, why has storytelling become so important? Why does it matter so much?
Well, Ian, you know that storytelling, or the ability for technology or complex B2B brands to be able to connect and generate a connection between them and their customer or potential customer, is so important. And storytelling really helps, large complex brands to do that, but not just large ones, actually small ones as well. And the reason that I think it's become so important is that there was a piece of work that happened where, it dawned on people within B2B marketing, and maybe that we'd known it for a long time, but we needed an external piece of research to help us to tell the story, was that actually B2B, in a B2B environment, you're not marketing and selling from Ericsson to Citibank, which is not a customer of ours, so I can use that as an example. That's not what we do. We talk between a person in Ericsson to a person in Citibank. And I actually used a lot of that when I was at Samsung, actually. And so to use that example, in Samsung, my responsibility as a team, my responsibility, and therefore my team's responsibility, was how do we go to market and tell the Samsung story to large enterprises like Citibank, but also to small, one, maybe two-man bands within a small and medium-sized enterprise. How do we tell a story that's relevant for them when we're trying to tell them about air conditioning, printing, mobile technology, network technology? So we had a lot to say, and to a lot of different people. So how did we simplify that, and how did we create a story framework that allowed us to have that initial conversation, that when the time was right, we could then get into more of the technical details? And I think it's that essence of the story that allows you to go on a journey to be able to do that. One of the things that I'm recruiting right now at Ericsson, and one of the things I'm looking for when I'm bringing people in is we have a lot of people in Ericsson, and I'm sure, and I know actually this is the same in many B2B environments. You have a lot of people in the company that really know about the product. They really know what you do. They know the technical aspects. But how many people in the company are able to put those words into a story that then can have meaning and resonate with the customer? And that really is a skill set that I'm looking for when I'm hiring. But also I think it's something that, as a B2B marketing and communications function, we really need to be championing that. So, it's certainly a new mindset, but it's one that we're seeing more and more. I'd say with that, though, we need to be clear when we talk about stories, because stories can sit sometimes at too much of a high level, and therefore they don't have meaning for a customer. And so when you're creating that story, you have to remember and be really, really conscious of what it is you as a brand bring to that story, and therefore how is that going to help the customer? Because if you create a story that doesn't really reflect who you are, then it's not going to be authentic, and it's not going to be bought by the customer. It's not going to be bought by your salespeople internally. So really connecting those dots, I think, is really important in storytelling, so that the story you tell is one that resonates, rather than just telling a story for story's sake. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I love it. So it is that thing that's talked about, isn't it? It's that kind of human to human thing.
Yeah.
And so in a role, that sounds such a big role you're doing there at Ericsson. And obviously the potential for telling stories when you've got such kind of complex products and services and such complex markets is really key. And I'm just curious about, behind every business and behind every brand, there's a story, and there's the backstory of Ericsson that goes way back to 1876. I did my homework, Lars Magnus Ericsson in Stockholm. And I just wonder whether, does that origin story have a place anywhere in 2020 when you're talking about Ericsson's work? Does the fact that human backstory to Ericsson, the corporation, does that sit anywhere, or is it just kind of a nice to have somewhere on the About Us page?
Oh, it certainly sits within our culture, and it certainly it does certainly sit within how we should be and how we do position ourselves. But let me give you an example that's not Ericsson, because I'm quite new here. So let me give you an example from Tektronix. So and I did this piece of work when I was at Tektronix with a very good colleague of mine, Steve Wilmore, where we looked at what was the Tektronix story. So Tektronix had been around, I think it was 70 plus years at this point in time. So like Ericsson, had been around a long time. And one of the things that we saw when I joined Tektronix is that we were attempting to tell our story, but we were always telling a story about yesterday and not about tomorrow. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to be very, very proud as Tektronix about our heritage, but also make sure that that story had meaning for people when they were going to be engaging with Tektronix to make a purchase, or even before purchase to be aware of who we were. So we did a piece of work that said what kind of makes up our DNA as a company, and therefore what are those kind of parts of the company that we can really hero when we go out and communicate, and then make that part of the story. And as much as we focused on all of the legacy, and Tektronix had done some amazing things, we also started to think about what were the stories that we were going to be creating with our customers for the future. And it was that future looking piece in storytelling that I think is really important for, or I would encourage other leaders to think about when they're creating stories. Stories don't just have to be the things that you did behind you, they can be the things that you're going to do in the future as well. And I think that's definitely, when I look at a lot of stories, I see them reflecting back, and it's always good to do that, but you have to then take it into today and then into tomorrow as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that interests me, Sally, is the opportunity for business leaders to tell their own personal stories, because I know it can be really humanizing. And as you said earlier, it's about one human in one organization talking to another human. So if that's done at a leadership level, that still matters. And I know from the work we've done together that that's something that you're quite keen on. And I know that you have stood on stage and in a B2B marketing setting context have kind of shared part of the Sally story. And I do know that some people I talk to, and some people perhaps listening in, watching this, sometimes people are quite reticent about sharing their personal story in a professional setting. And I just wonder whether you could kind of share with us why you think that matters, and what, why you were brave enough to kind of do that, and perhaps to encourage why other people who might not be sure about it, why it might be a good idea.
Yeah, sure. I think it all comes down to the why. And so for me, as in a marketing and communications environment, we think about our why. We think about, how we demonstrate the brand that we work for's why whenever we're going to go out there and have the meaningful conversations, whether that through, shining a light on that why for sales enablement, whether it's the why for some of the marketing materials that might go on the website, etc. We're always trying to think, okay, so what's the why in this? And that for me was the driver of why I wanted to share my story within a B2B environment. Because I started off this call by saying, I didn't go to university and say I really want to, I want to be a VP of in B2B marketing. I didn't wake up and say that. But what I did know was that I had certain drivers within my own environment that were really important to me, that meant that I used those as a way of making decisions. And those decisions that I've made have all been about how can I be the best that I can possibly be at work. And one of the things for me is to work for a company where their values and mine are shared. And that's really important to me. That's part of my why. That's part of the thing that allows me to get up and go and drive for success at work, but also to be really happy at work and to be happy in my personal life as well. And so that kind of blurring of the lines between what success looked like and understanding my own why was something that I realized as I started to make decisions through my career that helped me to navigate. And the reason I wanted to share some of those learnings was that, we're all at different parts of our career journey. And I think if we can pay back, and if we can do something that will help someone to make a decision, not for me to tell someone this is what you should do, but more for them to understand that there is a way that you can connect with yourself, to ask yourself questions in the same way that you do for your business at work. Then you can maybe help yourself to make the best decisions that are best for you. There are, and I did stand up on a stage in the B2B marketing, and I have, and I'm really pleased that I did that, and I will continue to do, and to take opportunities to share my own journey through my career, and how I've made decisions that were right, and how I've made decisions that were wrong, because I think as much of how you can share and be open and honest about decision making that has gone really well and not, will help people to realize that, sometimes you need to be a bit brave, and you maybe need to be a bit bolder than you maybe think you will, because you don't always need to get it right. And I've shared that openly in a B2B marketing forum. I've now joined Ericsson. I'm here 7 weeks, and in this time I haven't met a single person that works for me. So I have a team of 54 people across a very large area, and I haven't met any of them in person. But what I wanted to do was to make sure that they got to know me as a person very, very quickly, because I believe that I don't, actually even more so now, I don't put on a different, I don't leave that door behind me and go into the rest of my house and become a different person than I am when I'm coming into this room, so therefore, how do they get to know me? How do they get to understand my why, so I can get to understand theirs, so we can drive for success for everyone. We've been doing some really great things, I think, and we've been trying them. So I've been experimenting with the team, because none of us have done this before. Well, none of us know, what this feels like. And I've been humbled by the way that people have responded to my openness, because one of the things I would share with people is the more open and open person you can be with your teams and with your peers, or just generally, I think the more that you'll get that back. Putting yourself out there, and I have seen personally that people will put themselves out there. So I've got to know more about my team than I would have definitely known about if I hadn't have maybe started off very in an open environment. So having this piece of ask me any questions, I've shared with them very openly my story, and how I got to sort of why I decided to join Ericsson. I'm very open with that, and some of the things that helped me to make the decision. I've shared with them, they've met James, who you've met as well. I've been meeting their families as well. I think this kind of it brings us closer together, as teams of people, because it makes us real, doesn't it? Because I don't know about you, Ian, but I'm the same person, whether it's whatever time of the day it is.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm with you on that, but I know that's not necessarily how everyone used to be. But I do wonder now, because, here I am working my home, here you're working in your home. I think it's much harder to have that separation. Because as you say, what's the punctuation mark between work and home? It's that wooden door behind you. And I think that is harder. And I think sharing our personal stories as a way of getting to know each other is great. And I also wonder whether, sharing stories of how we're dealing with lockdown, and sharing those human stories about, outside our working lives, outside of our career stories, just about what we're experiencing, is another way of kind of nurturing team spirit and getting to know people. And I think
making time to do that, I think, is important. So to that point, what we did was we put together like a virtual coffee session. I mean, everybody's doing it. That's not new. But what we did was we said, why don't you use your background to show a picture of somewhere that you love, or and that could be where you were born, or where you live now, or your favorite holiday destination, whatever it is. Show me a picture. And and these sessions that I've been running are completely, people can come if they want to come within the team, or they don't come. I've promised them that we won't share a single piece of business news. They will not, if they don't come, I promise you won't miss out on any kind of business update. But what you will do is have an opportunity just to have a chat. So I shared an image where I was born in London in 1976, and I went and had a look for a picture of London then. And, you know, London is a very important place in my family history, and it's a very important place to me. So I shared that, and I shared more about my parents and the journey that they went on, that allowed me to have the opportunities that I had. And then what happened was quite a change, because then everybody's pictures started to change. And then what they used as their picture and the way they talked about their story was just not as though that they were trying to share the best of them, their new boss, but actually it was, you know, we got some amazing stories about where people had lived and where people had grown up. And what happened was then we then built on that. So the following week, then we shared about food, because food is a very big, important part of being in lockdown. And you've got to remember, Ian, in my world, here at Ericsson, I had people on the phone who were in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and I had people who were in Italy, who were one of the first areas to be affected. And then you've got Brazil, who are now going through it. So, you know, I had people at very different stages going through lockdown who were sharing their stories, and then they were sharing their food stories. And then, you know, then we made a Spotify playlist, and this was honestly the most enriching hour for me as a way of onboarding, to get to know all of these people without having to, one, fly around the world, or two, see a lot of PowerPoint presentations about all of the different things that they were focusing on. So hearing their stories on the things that are important to them, really, I think, has been a great way of me onboarding in a company where I haven't met any of them.
It's amazing, isn't it? And do you think some of those rituals, you'll stick with them after lockdown, when you can get on a plane again? Do these sound like kind of rituals that, I mean, they feel very Sally, that you think, you know, you're gonna retain them as you go forward, regardless of whether we're in lockdown or not?
Absolutely. And we're trying to think about how do you continue them on. And so there's a Swedish tradition which I love already, called fika. And fika is basically an opportunity to have coffee and cake. I mean, who wouldn't want to work for a Swedish company if you are not encouraged to have coffee and cake? So just thinking about how we continue, whether it's coffee and cake, or whether we continue this way of people sharing their story in a very informal way, is something that I'm definitely looking to continue with. What I tell you, another quick story actually was, we do a virtual coffee. We do a coffee chat, which is normally filmed between our president and one of the leadership team. And I had a really interesting piece where normally wherever he is in the world is where we then, you know, work with the leader that he's meeting, and that's how we film the story. But one of the things that this has done is actually, rather than it be about where the location he's at, it's more about what are the most important topics that our employees want to hear about. So now we base our kind of the agenda and the narrative based on what it is our employees want to hear, rather than where he is. And just that switch means that actually suddenly, you know, people are hearing about topics that they really want to hear about, rather than it being determined on whether the next customer meeting was, or things like that. So I think there's going to be some real wins as we start to see the easing of some of these things as we go forward. And I think that's a great opportunity for the way we work.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of fika. Yeah, very human, and sharing stories over coffee and cakes sounds cool. Back to more broadly, the time we find ourselves in with technology, and not just you know, you work in technology marketing, but just in terms of, we have all these digital platforms, don't we, for storytelling? And I'm just wondering what your take is as a marketeer on, you know, what some of your favorite platforms for telling story. Do you still think nothing sometimes beats the written word? Also, you know, video and you know, the moving image is obviously a lovely, very emotively triggering storytelling. You know, you can do amazing things with 30 minutes of video, can't you? I mean, do you have any favorite platforms? What kind of works best for what stories?
Well, I think I have, well, one of my big passions is actually that when you tell a story, you think about how it works through multiple platforms. And sorry to not give you a very direct answer, Ian, but ultimately I want it to be, the story needs to be integrated through everything we're doing. And then you need to think about how you do that. So firstly, you know, making sure that if we're going to go and tell stories, that we decide that we're going to tell the story in an end-to-end way, whether it's through, you know, the written form, whether it's going to be in video, whether it's going to be on a particularly, if it's going to be on a social media channel, if it's going to be delivered at an event. I want to see the story come to life in multiple ways. That's my kind of rally cry in Ericsson, but also in previous companies, is that we need to think about how we take that story to market in an integrated fashion, so that it doesn't become random acts that we do in different places, so that it has a kind of a building up on the story. So that's the first thing. I also think we need to think about when we do take it out, and if we use video, for example, let's think about, you know, what we might be able to write 1,000 words on. If we're delivering it in video, it might have to be in 50 words. So we're going to have to be really, really conscious of the way in which the story is being told, so that we get it across in the best way possible. And I see, unfortunately, examples where people are doing their absolute best to tell a story, but they think that they can tell the story in the same way in a long form video as they can in a long form blog post versus a LinkedIn post. And we have to be relevant. We have to realize and make sure that the story is told in a relevant way depending on the channel. And so my sort of ask is, one, make it a narrative that exists not just in one place but across multiple. But when you do that, make sure that you do it in the most appropriate way for the audience ultimately.
Yeah, I agree. It's not one size fits all, is it? And what
No.
about that sense of, ultimately, you know, whether I'm standing on stage telling a personal story, or whether it's a documentary we're watching, or it's an Ericsson message, you know, ultimately we want to try and get the audience to care, don't we? We want them to care that our story matters. And I just wonder whether you've got, it might be hard to nail in a little kind of one-liner, but I wonder if you've got any kind of advice about, across all your career in B2B marketing, like, you know, what it takes to, because let's face it, you know, it's sometimes you've got to be conscious of, you know, where the value is in a product or service to make someone, why should someone care about it? I just wonder if you've got any advice or any take on what those essential ingredients are.
Yeah, I think I'd say the first thing I'd say is a comment from my boss here at Ericsson. His level of empowerment on me, which allows me to empower the rest of my team to do what they do best, is incredibly important. So he says to me, look, I've hired you as the expert in marketing and communication, so therefore you advise me. And if ever there was a department that really should be the expert on storytelling, it is this department. You know, if you think about, I don't question whether, you know, the best place for adding up the numbers and accounts is sitting in finance. In the same way, I don't, you know, question whether the best place for sort of talent management is in HR or people function. Storytelling is in the sweet spot of the marketing and communications team. It doesn't mean that we're not the only ones to do it, but we have to own that. So one, making sure that, you know, you work, for me anyway, making sure I work in an environment where I'm empowered to do that has been a sort of a lens, if you like, of which I've looked things through. Naturally, I ask a hell of a lot of questions, and I encourage people to do that, because I think if you ask a lot of questions, then you can start to unpick things, because what might have been seen as a story actually isn't a story. It's more of a, you know, it doesn't have any depth, and a story has to have depth to it. Because if you don't ask the questions on it, I guarantee by the time it gets to the customer, or if it's a sales piece, or whoever the audience is, they will ask the questions. So you should be asking those before them. And then I think my final two things is you need to ask, if I build on the questions thing, you need to have the lens of so what. And that's a really tough thing to say. And then maybe that's the kind of British part of me, and maybe the London kind of thing, but it's the so what. It's a, you know, why should someone care? Why should somebody take an action to engage with you? And I think that's, you know, the final piece of that But all of that comes under this wrapper, or is all within a wrapper of being bold and brave. And if we want to be seen within marketing communications as being storytellers, which we absolutely should own that, then we need to challenge what is the perception of what this, B2B tech marketing department should be doing, which has been in the traditional sense being very techy and product focused and, lead generation and, all of the metricy pieces that are important, but they're not the only things. So if we want to step up and own the storytelling piece, then we need to ask a lot of questions. We need to be hard on ourselves around the so what, but ultimately we need to be bold and brave and do it. And sometimes that's not the easiest thing, to be bold and brave, because you might not feel like it, but I can encourage people to definitely do that. And having done that at Samsung and asked the difficult questions, when we were launching a new device there, it was, what's the so what, how does that new device make a difference to John the plumber? How does it really help him? Versus how does that help Keith, who's the CIO at Citibank? Ask those difficult questions, look for the story, but make sure the story has depth, and go and make it happen, because no one else is empowered to do that, or shouldn't be more empowered to do it than these teams. So yeah.
I love that. I think that so what thing is a great question, because I think we can all get stuck in our own bubbles, whether in a department or a relationship with an agency, and we all love it so much and soak it all up. And actually, what is someone outside of that really going to think? So it's a great question. Look, before we run out of time, I know you're a busy woman, Sally. I'm just curious to know what kind of stories you're drawn to when you shut that door behind you and close the door on Ericsson for the day. Like if you're going to sit down and watch something on the sofa or on your laptop, Netflix, or go for a run, listen to a podcast, what kind of stories are you drawn to?
I love real life stories where people have made something happen despite maybe the circumstances. So I've just finished watching, it's the Michael Jordan documentary. It's a 10-parter, and what I love about it is I had no idea about basketball, and I had no idea about Pippen and Jordan and all of these different people. But if a story maker can take a topic and really, really take you on a journey and really engage with you, even if it's a topic that, I certainly would never have said to you that I'm going to go and watch a basketball documentary, but it's, a human story that's told in a fantastic way, it definitely will get my attention. I watched Senna, the documentary. Again, I mean, I'm sounding like I'm a big sports fan, and anyone that knows me knows that's not true unless it's rugby. I know nothing about motor racing, and wow, just beautiful storytelling and documentaries particularly really get my attention.
Well, thank you. That's the second time this week someone's recommended The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan thing. So definitely going to put that on my list. Well, look, thank you so much for spending time with me today, Sally, and lifting the lid on storytelling. It's been really fascinating. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks, Ian.